Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to our panelists this morning and also to Mariana for her moderation. So as we have heard this morning, we've heard about the importance of state capacities and capabilities in governments to take a mission-oriented innovation approach. And in the next session, we're going to specifically talk about digital state capacities and grand challenges. This session will be moderated by David Eaves, who is the Deputy Director of IIPP and Associate Professor in Digital Government. And David will introduce our panelists today.
Perfect, thank you. Do we have to turn these on, or do they automatically, magically? Oh, they do magically happen. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is David Eaves. I'm very, very excited to be here. One of the things that I'm very focused on digital because here I think there's just this enormous or this really interesting moment where I think governments are finally beginning to wrap their head around what technology and what digital means. And it's starting to create new capacities and new ways for governments to act. And in fact, one of my favorite slides from the last 5 years is it's a slide that says like the thing that drove digital transformation in my organization was, and then it says like the CIO, the CEO, and then it says COVID. And then there's a big red circle around COVID because the moment you told everybody that they had to shelter in place, but you still needed to provide them with services and engage them, the main mechanisms by which you were going to do that well and in a scaled way was going to be using technology. And then I think that the part that then follows on that's so interesting is I look around the world, the places in the world that were among the most effective in doing that were not the mature markets where, the cabinet would decide that everybody should get $2,000 to help cover expenses during the crisis. But it was actually, and then, weeks would go by while the checks got printed and mailed out, and then people who were dead would receive checks. But meanwhile, in places like Bangladesh, where Anir is in the audience, Anir, you should wave hi, Anir's in the audience, and places like India, places like Brazil, or even Togo, the money would go straight into people's bank accounts or straight into their cell phone accounts, and they instantaneously had money. And so I think the big narrative right now is that actually many emerging markets are moving much faster and much better than mature markets. So to kind of talk about all of this, we have three amazing panelists with us. Online is Galsana, who's a director general with the Ukrainian government, who's been in charge of engagement with the Atlantic and Euro areas. But Ukraine's been doing incredible work as a result of the tragedy that's happening in its country. Francesca Bria, who in addition to being an honorary professor with us here at the IPP, is the president of the Italian National Innovation Fund. And then Nandan Nilekani to immediate right, who is the chairman and co-founder of Infosys in India. But I think more interesting for us is the founding chairman of the Unique Identification System in India, which has led to kind of really, really dramatic impacts in helping people and thinking about rethinking public services. So what I'm going to do is just kind of move rightwards out and just have each talk a little bit about how technology is changing state capacity and how they're thinking about that challenge in their country. So Nandan, do you want to maybe say a few words?
Yeah, thanks, David. It's great to be here. And I think, we've been working on this issue in India now for about 15 years, from 2009. And the idea has been that if a society and economy is going to become more and more digitally intensive, every part of our lives is, in some sense, has technology, a digital technology in it. How do we architect or create a digital public infrastructure which is inclusive, which is creates green economic growth, which allows people to meet their aspirations and so on. So rather than think of it as a set of applications, we think of it as a digital public infrastructure which can be used for different purposes. So if you have the plumbing, for example, for sending money into a bank account, that plumbing can be used for COVID, emergency money. That plumbing can be used for energy subsidies. So the idea is create plumbing which is agnostic to the application, and then make that available to different uses. So our journey has been, one of course was the ID system Aadhaar, which I led and started it in the government in 2009, and today there are 1.3 billion people on the ID who use it 80 million times a day for authentication. They also have KYC, with which you can open a bank account or get a mobile connection, and both the banking penetration, which has gone from 20 to 80% bank accounts, as well as the mobile penetration, which has gone up to 700 million mobile users, who has been enabled because the KYC reduces the cost of onboarding and time of onboarding. And then we have a payment system for real-time payments called UPI, which does about 9 billion transactions a month. 300 million people use it, 50 million QR codes at merchants. But very importantly, we have an architecture for data where historically we know that data is a byproduct of all our digital activities. And this has essentially been harnessed by companies and governments, companies to make money, governments to do surveillance or whatever. But we really haven't had an architecture where people can use the data for their own good. And so we have something called data empowerment architecture, which allows individuals and businesses to use their digital footprint to get access to services, which essentially puts data on its head and puts it at the service of the people who create the data. So that's actually rolling out for credit now and for other financial applications. But the architecture is agnostic to the sector. It can be in health or education or wherever. So I think broadly speaking, what has happened is using state capacity to build digital public infrastructure, which is plumbing, which allows you to be agnostic to the use case, but architect it in a way that there's infrastructure enabled by the state, standard APIs to use that, and then private innovation can be on top of that, but within the guardrails that you define. So maybe I'll stop here.
That sounds great. I mean, for me, I think the one thing that is just always hard to press home is I think how little particularly mature markets look at emerging markets. I mean, India did more digital transactions last year, like more than, I think, double of China and more than the UK, Germany, France, and Germany combined. And that goes from a place where they had almost no digital transactions happening, like, a decade ago. So there's this huge opportunity to scale. Sometimes it's just hard to convey to people just how fast the change can happen and how much you can shape and create markets by just creating an infrastructure layer that people can build on top of. Francesca.
Yeah. Thank you. So first of all, a real pleasure to be here. I guess I will be a bit more problematizing the question of digital infrastructures. I think, first of all, public digital infrastructures is not a given at all. So we shouldn't give it for granted. I think you're putting on the table, I think, a very, very strategic and important question, which is also a question of power balance in society, a question of empowerment, a question of what values in societies are we fostering? Are we empowering, for example, citizens to use and access digital infrastructure in a way that we can reduce inequalities in societies? How are we doing that? I think at the moment, just to broaden up a bit the reflection, I mean, I will speak a bit about the EU, what the EU is doing, but I think we have to be aware that we have never seen, I think, in the history of the Industrial Revolution, such a concentration of infrastructural power and capacity, actually not in the hands of the governments or the state or the citizens, but in the hands of private companies when it comes to digital infrastructures. So I think the pandemic was a kind of waking up call for many of us, because we realized that digital infrastructures are underpinning essential services of society. So healthcare, education, work and labor, democracy. And, we all kind of were, let's say, very worried when we saw that a lot of citizen participation and even elections were happening on private platforms where, data was misused, not only for misinformation and so on, but also really manipulated for elections. And you know something about this topic in the UK here. And so we realized that connectivity, but also, as he was saying, digital identity, the way we use data, payment systems, and broader than that, are essential services of society. Now we have to see, okay, where are those technology? Who owns this technology at the moment? Are they in private hands or public hands? And where we can have, an interaction that's beneficial really for society. So I think there is a level of digital infrastructure, and I don't know if you have it in the conversation later on, but I think that it's really a matter of industrial policy. Because if you look at the high-scale investment, and also let's don't really hide the question that at the moment, if you look at the geopolitical situation, and probably we're going to talk a little bit about that in Ukraine, not only the political, it's not only geo, because there is a lot of cybernetics, there is a lot of weaponization in the digital space, but also we are seeing a little bit of a war in decoupling, of course, between the US and China in digital infrastructures when it comes to the basic microchips, artificial intelligence. I mean, that's really where the digital supremacy at the moment is playing out. And I think, obviously, coming from the EU perspective, I really wish that Europe could be much more this force to kind of have a dialogue when it comes, for example, to digital privacy, to antitrust, because, it's very important also the digital regulation to break monopolies and so on, but also to have common standards in the digital space that would allow us not to have this kind of new Cold War, between these two big powers, but what you just said at the beginning, where also smaller states, the global South, Latin America, India, and so on, can play a role, and Europe, of course, in shaping the digital world. So I didn't want to broaden it too much, but I think it's actually important to get it straight what's happening. So I think when it comes to the deep infrastructures like cloud computing, microchips, and so on, and the artificial intelligence, this is super concentrated. This is definitely not in the hands of the government at the moment, this infrastructure. And I think, obviously, there is going to be much more long-term patient investment. Maybe when it comes to artificial intelligence, I would advocate for a much stronger public approach, because obviously artificial intelligence is a critical infrastructure of society. The data and the knowledge is produced by all of us, and I think it's absolutely critical that we can have a kind of, public or artificial intelligence in the public interest or as a public good, which is managed differently from today. Now, just to go back to the question of digital ID, data interoperability and data sovereignty, and maybe payment system. So my example will be what Europe is doing, which I think it's very interesting because at the moment, due to the Next Generation EU and all the digital programs of the European Union, we are seeing about 400 billion going into digitization and digital infrastructures. And there is a cryptographic identity framework which is being rolled out by the EU that I think has a very important approach when it comes to data sovereignty and the privacy of citizens, which of course is very important because the EU is taking an approach, for example, that says it is very problematic to have the kind of surveillance capitalism, let's say, so to have biometric identity, centralization of data, and let's say a layer of surveillance, but not only because of privacy, but also because it's like then you could discriminate in very different ways the access that you give to citizens in terms of universal access to services. So we're going a bit minimal, let's say, so cryptographic digital ID system that allows citizens to be the one that own the data and can decide with data spaces, interoperability, open standards, and data sovereignty. And I think they have to be by design, of course. So it's like digital rights by design in the digital infrastructure. So citizens to be in control of how they use the data, to decide what data they want to share, what data they want to keep private, on what terms, and what's happening with their data. I think this is going to be a fundamental part of how, democratic is going to be this digital world that we're living in. And when it comes to digital payment, which I think, anyway, we can learn a lot from India also in how they built this sovereign stack, because I think we are lagging behind a sovereign stack in Europe. But anyway, I think digital payments, the central bank is now really doing it. So I think it will come, this digital currency, state-backed digital currency, hopefully with the cryptographic ID, privacy preserving, rolled out by the European Central Bank soon. And I think this could be then, if the nation states, take it on, a really good starting point for rolling out pan-European services in healthcare, in education, in cities, and so on. And, with, of course, why do we do digital? To empower people to have a better healthcare, to fight climate change, to improve our cities, and so on. And I finished by saying that for me, it is not only a question of state capacity, but societal capacity more broader. So I really like really invite you, if you are in a central government, to think about partnerships. On one side with citizens, so maybe get the cities involved. You know, I've been doing this work for a long time when I was the CTO of Barcelona, but also with the UN, linking cities, because cities are on the ground with citizens, and you can have a much more participatory approach to digital infrastructures. And on the other side, if you have a robust, of course, digital public infrastructures, you can get companies and also small, you know, SMEs, startups, innovative players to build services on top. And this was also said before. So this partnership element, societal partnership, will be very, very important.
Thank you. Gülsana, do you want to share a little bit about the experience of the Ukraine? Gülsana, can you maybe share a little bit about the experience coming out of the Ukraine and kind of what you've learned about state capacity, particularly in the digital era, in a kind of real crisis? Gülsana, we can't hear you. I don't know if you're muted.
Yes, I continue to do it like so many, Zooms and virtual calls, but I still have this problem. So, sorry. Minister of Digital Transformation was created in 2019, and it was like really politically addressed focus that now we're going do a lot in digital transformation. And it was one of the highlighting like agenda when the President Zelensky was elected, and the minister was there to implement his vision, what is a state in a smartphone. So it's fair to say that in terms of like building digital infrastructure, we were really at a good point actually before the pandemic. So just a year after the ministry was created, we launched national ecosystem DIA, which now introduce more like access to the more than 100 public services and dozens of digital documents to Ukrainians. And it's become, so Ukrainians are really like enabled to engage with the government online in a one-stop shop, from applying like for benefits and government programs, paying taxes, access important documents which are valid and have the same legal force as a paper or plastic one, can register and run business, and there's a lot of like most of the services are automated, which is mean there's no human decision somewhere in the middle, and they are done like really in a quick and convenient way provided. And many information, the most of the information is checked online and already like government, because government already had this information. And following Russian full-scale invasion, which started February 2022, so this already built digital infrastructure allowed Ukrainians to receive social support with government, receive like and especially we were able to help those who are in regions and hostility regions, so and impacted by the war and has like Ukrainian displaced Ukrainians, so they all have, we created like special services for them, providing benefits, and they were able to apply for assistance. Sorry, I see there, and for financial assistance. And register damaged property, and etc. So it should be like the digital public infrastructure. If you say about this like ecosystem that enables participation of citizens and better like engagement and bringing them, enable them to engage with the government, was already there. And it's allowed us to be much more resilient and allowed us to really like fast address new challenges.
Thank you. So I think the two themes I really want to pull out first is kind of both Nanda and Francesca mentioned, there was a period where a lot of these capacities were broadly private. And in the last 5 years, there's a growing realization that actually this really is infrastructure, and that if you're going to run a modern society, there's a basic level of digital capacity that has to exist. And I think there's a debate on to what degree is that public versus to what degree is that private? And so one thing I'd love to maybe hear from you is where does the boundary lie between where the private should start and where the public should start? So what should the state be trying to engage in controlling? The second big theme is this really is infrastructure. And so I think the previous two, there'd been a lot of things of kind of like, oh, every ministry should have its own capacity to identify citizens. Every ministry should have its own capacity to take payments. And really you want to start thinking of this as like an infrastructure layer that you need to operate a modern society. And so I think the second question I have for each of you is, governments really are designed around the silos of ministries, and they aren't necessarily as prepared to think about what an infrastructure view of the kind of world looks like. So I'd love to kind of hear, what have you been doing to try to overcome this instinct of government to kind of siloize things as opposed to think about a kind of society scale or infrastructure? Maybe we'll start with Francesca and then work our way around.
Yeah, I think this is a key question. I think for the first part of the question, definitely as we are saying, focusing for government on, okay, for me, they should focus on what do we want to achieve through digitization. So the point, I don't think, is starting technology first, obviously, and think, okay, the usual techno solution is we are going to solve everything. I remember 10 years ago, this conversation has a bit changed, but we have a problem, we build an app. No, we know now that this is not the right way of thinking about complex problems and thinking about how do we, put forward resilient solutions and infrastructures to empower, us tackling big societal challenges. So I think you want to start what is essential. So there are parts of the infrastructure about, delivering essential services to citizens that obviously have to pass through this digital identity system, because I know, in the UK, I don't know how this sounds, but obviously I think the question there is that identification as we know today, and I was advocating this, this is a bit uncomfortable because it's not done in the same way everywhere, but to say that you can do it privacy preserving, I think this is the European way. And I still think this is the way to go, because if you do it privacy preserving, you can also preserve the trust of people using the system vis-a-vis otherwise, having this kind of unlimited access to everything we do and our data that it's ending up in a situation that I think it's not very compatible with trying to preserve fundamental rights, at least as we kind of define them in liberal democracies. Then you have the question of data infrastructure, and then I've been doing a lot of my work. Now I've been doing work, for example, in cities, starting from Barcelona, but now in Hamburg, which is a city-state, and at the UN level. And then we are trying to say, okay, not only cities can, have public infrastructures for data, but also how do you start getting back private data to public for the public interest? So having a kind of universal data sharing law that would allow this data to become really a public infrastructure. And why I think it's fundamental, and then you can see, okay, what data? I think first of all, you have to know that basically you can do that by preserving GDPR on one side, so your privacy, but also preserving trade secrets. So it's not like companies sharing the data have to give away the right to do meaningful business with the data. So you can have a balanced approach, but this data, for example, imagine how do we know CO2 consumption in cities, and how do we tackle the question of climate change if we don't have the data? It's basically impossible to do it. So the data, I think it's a fundamental part of the public infrastructure, and then we have to see what's happening with the data, with artificial intelligence engines, and what requirements we put for companies to use this data, because at the moment they're just grabbing everything without us asking anything in rewards. So this kind of rewards for the public, it's not happening. And then I think the public payment system, so is a bit what it was said before, obviously should be public. And then I think, yeah, okay, the broader conversation, of course, is what do we do with the rest, and how do we have public-private partnership for the rest of the infrastructure. Coming to capabilities, I think this is critical. As we know, this is not only technological capabilities in government in order to work with data, but it's questions, around, for example, intellectual property rights. It's questions around procurement and what conditionalities and what clauses you put in procurement. It's questions around new type of skills and new type of capability. So it's a lot of different things that can only happen if you train, across ministries, I think, but if you focus your attention on having horizontal capabilities. It's not only technology, obviously, the key question.
Gülsana, I'd love to hear a little bit on the deployment of DIA and the being able to offer services across Ukraine. Like, how did the government have to reimagine itself, or what new capacities did it have to build in order to be able to deliver services digitally everywhere?
Actually, it was approached before the war started. We definitely understood that we built the products and started to implement it, and then there were so many constraints and obstacles. So on the national level, on the regional level, on the level of citizens and businesses, so we really had several measures how to address it. The first, we created such I call it tree in the government. It's basically mean that in every ministry in Ukraine, on the national level, there is a position, Chief Digital Transformation Officer, and every ministry have this, digital ambassadors, digital teams, and they're really connected to the Minister of Digital Transformation, and they appoint the Chief Digital Transformation CDDO appointed with the agreement with the Vice Prime Minister on Digital Transformation. So it's really prioritizing and showing the digital transformation is super cross-sectoral. It's everywhere. And then we went to the regional level, and because of decentralization reform, it was much harder for us. But here we already not, employ the powers, but also I would say leadership instruments. So we made a lot of convenings. The state administration in the region, they also have Chief Digital Transformation Officers, the same as the national level, but it's the difference that there's no bureaucracy. So we had to employ convening, provide them with all the instruments, help them to work, so be connected in our digital transformation journey. And another, I would say, constraining capabilities, may I say, it's citizens actually who were in the beginning. Now, of course, its situation really changed because of the pandemic and because of the war. But in the beginning, when we introduced hey, you have digital passport in your wallet, or you can open bank account online. So there was, there was a space to work, I would say, and bring people there to understand that it's convenient, efficient, but also provide digital skills, because now we see we have democratic, I would say, chart, yes, and we see that these solutions, GovTech solutions, are for everyone, because also people of elegant age using it quite broadly, and young people, of course, they were first. But in the beginning, we had to push a lot in digital skills in terms of make people able to use digital services and to trust. So we went through this journey, and yeah, it was successful. And also from the business, but it's maybe I will bring example from SMEs. When we introduced digital driver license, so we wanted to scale it. Why we started from digital documents? Because we wanted really go and scale digital GovTech solutions. So we started with digital passport, digital driver license. Many people have it, perfect. And then the first use case in Ukraine when digital driver's license I used, it's actually buying alcohol in supermarket. So we went and like we were saying that now it's legal. You can buy alcohol in supermarket with digital driver license, and then there was constraints from business and who was kind of more afraid of there's legal uncertainties. We're not sure, the risks are on us, so we had to actually pass a law that it's not illegal, that it's illegal not to accept digital documents in Ukraine. So it's I'm saying about this, in terms of building capacity, like technological from just to accept and work with the GovTech solutions, digital documents, and digital services.
I love this story about people being nervous. Like the businesses are like, can we actually accept these IDs? Am I going to be in trouble if I sell this person alcohol, using their digital ID? Like there are so, like once you start thinking infrastructure, there's so many stakeholders that need to kind of come on board and get engaged for this to work. Nandan, as the founding chairperson of the Unique Identity Authority in India, you had a kind of cabinet level position. And so you had a real view of kind of how the government was wrestling with what an infrastructure view looks like. And then also, as someone who's been in the private sector, I'd be curious, like, what are your thoughts around where does the public end and where does the private begin? How do we think about that?
Thanks, David. Well, first of all, I think one is when we talk about digital public infrastructure, we all believe that, I think generally that the state has to be more active in it. And but I think we need to separate the two types of things. One is, given that digital infrastructure is going to be ubiquitous and all pervasive and it has winner take all behaviors, there's the part of what the state has to do, which is to do with the harms that it causes, right? So you want to prevent monopolies, you want to prevent data misuse, you want to make sure the network is secure, you want to create competition. And so there's a set of, you want to make sure the AI is explainable or doesn't have bias. There's a whole set of things which governments have to do to ensure no harm. And the second part of it, which is what is it the state has to be proactive in building to enable this use of this digital infrastructure in a way that the country benefits or the society benefits. So there's slightly different things and we should not mix up the two things. Now on the second one, which is the theme of this conference, which is how do we, I think whether it's a company or a government, technology architecture follows the organization structure, right? So if you want to create digital public infrastructure, which is ubiquitous and cross-platform, its ownership in the government system must be with somebody who owns it, the cross-platform. And in some sense, I was fortunate that I was reporting to the Prime Minister, so I had a cross-platform view. And similarly, Anir is part of the PM's office in Bangladesh. So I think having that leadership at the Prime Minister or President level is important, because otherwise, it just gets siloed into something or the other. Second thing is that the other way we thought about that was to separate foundational identity from, applied identity, functional identity. So a driver's license has both, of course, serves as an ID, but it also serves as a way of telling the people that you are eligible to drive a car. A passport is an ID which also tells you that you can travel abroad. So we focused not on the functional ID, because the functional ID is the departmental ambit. We only said that John is John, or Abdul is Abdul, or Ashok is Ashok. Whether John deserves a driver's license is still taken by that ministry. Whether John deserves a passport is taken. So you have to sort of layer this in a way that you separate foundational ID from functional ID. And that's how you create infrastructure, in these things. Now, coming specifically to payments, I think, frankly, the CBDC is just a solution to a problem that we don't know what problem it's solving. The CBDC was essentially a response to the rise of cryptocurrencies and, DAME and all these things. So nobody actually knows what it does. I think you actually can fix payment problems by creating a real-time, low-cost payment system using fiat currency, which is what Brazil has done with PIX, which is what India has done with UPI. And that actually solves a whole host of things without having to create one more currency and so on. And finally, let me also talk about how do we enable this capacity in the state. Now, in the Indian case, we had a mechanism to bring in a lot of technology talent in the system from outside, so therefore to complement the people inside. But we also created a new class of institutions called National Information Utilities, which are non-profit companies which ran the tech platforms. And these had their own CEO, they were non-profit, so they didn't have a profit motive. So today, for example, the whole payment system is run by a company called NPCI, which is a non-profit company whose job is to make the payment system work. Similarly, our whole tax system is run by a company called GSTN, and so on and so forth. So you may need to create new types of institutions which are technologically competent to execute and implement, which are non-profit in nature, which have a more long-term-ish view. Because when you do these government projects departmentally, then there's a silo problem, right? So if it's the finance ministry, they will focus on the banking use case. If we go with the home ministry, they'll focus on the security use case. Second problem is that bureaucrats change. And once bureaucrats keep changing, getting transferred, then the purpose gets mixed up. And therefore, having longer-term institutions that have a solidity of purpose is very important, which is what we have done. So just a couple of points.
I think I'd like to go to the audience for questions. So as you're beginning to percolate in your brain some questions you ask, for me, the transformation that I think is so interesting, you mentioned Pix in Brazil and UPI in India, is I don't think 20 years ago if someone had said, oh yeah, the state's going to run a payment system by which people are going to do all transactions online. Most people, sorry, thank you, yes, the state created.
No, first of all, when we take paper currency, who runs that? The state runs it. The Bank of England prints notes. So why are we getting excited if the state is running digital payments? There's no law that says digital payments should be done by the private sector. So I think you have to create an architecture where the state enables these payments and allows private sector to use that, which is what we mean by saying, which comes to your last question, which is how do we architect things so that what is it that the state does? It provides minimal digital infrastructure and interoperability frameworks and APIs and so on, and allows multiple market players to interact and compete so that there's no winner take all. There's a certain thought process on how we layer things to separate what the state does from what the markets do.
No, I just wanted to pick up a couple of things. I think it's super interesting, this question of the need to create new types of institutions. For example, these kind of institutions which are companies, but with a public mission. For example, we're working with Rainer on this topic on data trust and, at a city scale, but that could scale at a European level. And we're thinking, okay, what form of institution should actually be running data that is public, private, and citizen data with the guarantees on how this data is used. So I think this question and the payment ecosystem in India is probably a really good use case for that and how this was built. So I think this is one point. On the other question, though, I have more issues there where you say, yeah, we just enable the infrastructure and then we make sure this is no winner take all and so on. That is where we are having a problem, because actually these platforms are winner take all, and they don't, we have a massive antitrust issue on digital platforms. This is not only thanks God, also in the US with Lina Khan, which is posing the question about how do we have to break up Amazon and how and so on. So it's
all I said was that when you design digital public infrastructure, you build in models of innovation and competition. So there is no winner take all. That's what I said.
No. So this is how to do that is absolutely fascinating and important.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting with places like Pix is it's run by the national banks. UPI is run by a company chartered, and it's really about, we are effectively creating monopoly, but one that is a monopoly that serves the public interest, as opposed to a private actor that might extract rents. That doesn't solve all problems, it creates some new problems, but it's kind of an interesting model that I don't think I've seen.
Yeah, fine. And this is, I think this is where the conversation, and maybe we open it up. Like, for example, I think we have to decentralize it a bit more, because to me it's like this kind of super centralized, but it's for the benefit of all, blah blah blah. It's so we have to take care that this doesn't become a kind of centralized big state, a bit totalitarian approach. And I'm just saying, where are the guarantees and the safeguards and the accountability and the trust and all of that, how do we build it into the system?
That's
Democracy.
There are certain things architecturally that may have to be centralized, in which case you need to put in the safeguards. There are certain things that can be distributed. So it's really a question of what problem you're trying to solve.
I'd love to go. Is there anybody in the audience who'd love to ask a question? Yes, this. Yeah. Yes. Hi. Let's just get you a microphone.
Thank you. I am Viljar Lubi. I am currently ambassador of Estonia here, but I used to be ambassador to India. And between jobs, I was Estonia's business secretary. I exactly wanted to ask about what was discussed, and this challenge that if you take, successful digital platforms and EID stories, I think Estonia is one of them that we introduced that more than 20 years ago. Aadhaar followed, and now DIA as well. All of them have one thing in common, or many things, that it was supply driven. It was strongly pushed by the government. It was also made compulsory because you need a critical mass, because you need to change the habits of the people extremely fast. I think that's why, for example, in Japan, my number has failed because they want to do it voluntarily and it doesn't work this way. But the question to maybe to Nandan and also a colleague from Ukraine is that given this country is, even to mention EID is politically toxic. So do you have any other ways to do it? How do you build a good digital infrastructure without actually being too centralized, what you said? Because, it seems that, it might be the only way, but how do you overcome this?
Sorry, do you want to take a crack? Gilsana, do you want to just talk a little bit about the Ukrainian experience on this?
Just because in Ukraine, it's not actually obligatory, so you don't have to have DIA and authenticator or have this. But, I think there's a lot of what we kind of miss in government. It's creating digital culture and at some point maybe even marketing. This is really important to build trust, and communication is also very important to people to understand how they will benefit, what you are building, how it's useful, and how it's cost reduction, time reduction, and how it's empower them and bring them to participate. So we create even special blocks. I would say it's like e-democracy, where we conduct polls, surveys, and people can actually engage with the government, with the local government, national government, really, really convenient and efficient way. So they feel empowered. And I think this is very important to have proper communication, which is should be aiming to create digital culture among the population. And Ukraine is really example where we have already 19 million users, which is, if you take elderly people and children, pretty much all the population of Ukraine. And every second Ukrainian for sure using DIA, and 70% of smartphones in Ukraine have DIA installed. And it's in the circumstances when it's not voluntarily. Of course, there's rises during pandemic, during the war. So these circumstances kind of, maybe at some point, help and lead to bring people to digital. But anyway, I think communication from the government should reconsider how we communicate. This is very important.
No, I think just to clarify, Aadhaar is not compulsory, but it became so ubiquitous and useful that everybody got it. So I want to make a slight distinction. No, I think finally you have to design these things so people see a benefit out of these things. Otherwise, why will they take it? But the fact is that if we allow the markets to do things, we have concerns about antitrust, monopolies and data and all that. If we allow the government to do things, we have concerns about surveillance and so on. So both of these things have risks. So, you can't walk away from the risk. We can spend our time endlessly debating the risks. We have to have a plan of action where the state does minimal things to enable these things to happen in a way that's inclusive, in a way that's ubiquitous, in a way that prevents monopolies from emerging, and act on that.
Hello, my name is Paul Brewer. I work for a local authority on the south coast of the UK. We've heard a lot about the need for the state to have a role to play in essentially identity and transactional services, but we've heard some mention of participatory democracy and citizen involvement, but no mention of the relationship between the state's role in that compared to privately owned social media companies. So I wondered, we've talked a lot about transactions, but not really about participatory democracy.
No, thank you. That's a very valid point. I've been working many years on this topic, both at the cities level, which I still think it's absolutely critical to link, at least here in the continent, including the UK, the city level and regional, level with what's happening at national and EU level. It's absolutely critical. I don't believe that, at least here, so it might be, very different in place to place, but it's not a one model. And here I really don't believe that this is going to happen top down, from kind of European Commission or national governments telling what to do with standards and so on. We tried it. I don't think it worked very well. I also don't think it really got people included and empowered. So I think a way to go is obviously setting the regulation and the standards and so on, but then involving from the ground up. And so when it comes to participatory democracy, for the reasons I mentioned before, if you only do it on private social networks, I mean, first of all, at the moment, it's really problematic also because the business model and the algorithms are monetizing polarization and disinformation. This is a fact, unfortunately, of the business model in itself, which is monetizing and manipulating personal information and data. We know this is a problem. And I think it is hard to fix from a private company, but also I think these networks weren't really built for democracy and participation. They are marketing platforms to sell advertising and services, and I think they should be used as such. So it's fine to use them as such, but if you're engaging citizens in participatory democracy, I think you have to build the right infrastructures that are built, for empowerment, avoiding algorithms that foster polarization, so more clicks on a kind of fake news go viral. I mean, with AI, synthetic generated content, now with multi-models, large language modeling process, which it's going to be a massive problem. Like, we don't actually know how to solve it. So what we've been doing is building platforms. If you look at what we built in Barcelona is called Decidim. It's open source, by the way, open software. So actually you can audit the algorithm, because this is a very important part, how we're going to be able to audit algorithms and audit the system in a way that they are accountable. And this is a massive question. But then it scaled from the city level. So the European Union used it for the conference on the future of Europe. So now you have instances all around the world, and it has all the languages. And it has been used across. It's open source, it's owned by the citizens. You can control how data misused or not, and it's much more accountable. So I really invite public officials to go for those kind of accountable open source solutions, which are much better for democratic participation, because they avoid the risks that we have seen happening all the time.
I think also my friend Ethan Zuckerman in Massachusetts has been writing a lot about kind of thinking about digital public infrastructure as a way of thinking about public spaces. So thinking about like what is like the new BBC, what is the new, like what would it look like if Twitter was publicly owned or owned by the public, and kind of like how do we problematize that? What does the NPR look like for the digital era? So I think that's kind of starts to get down that he might be worth looking at as well. Let's go to one last question before we wrap up, and I think you had a question there.
Tom Cole, BBC. Perfect timing. This has been really interesting. Just two of the things we really worry about with digital infrastructure at the BBC is trust. And that's not just trust within our services, but how can you trust the content that sits on these platforms? Particularly for news, what is the what is the digital town hall or the town square these days? But also we're acutely aware as a public organisation of not leaving people behind. So it'll be really interesting to get the panel's reflections on, as we push into digital, how we limit digital exclusion and ensure that those that aren't tech native or don't necessarily access can be brought along with these platforms.
So maybe I can, if I can, I'd just sort of reframe that question as a closing question for each speaker to look at, which is, I think this issue of trust is super important. And there's kind of how do we create trust for systems that are actually not run by the government? So there could be private media companies, Facebook, Twitter, whatever the social media platforms. But then I think there's equally critical question of how do we have trust in government provisions, infrastructure and services, so like identity and payments. So maybe for each of you, starting at Gulsanna, we'll work our way back. What are the key actions that government should be taking to engender trust in both of these ecosystems? And what have you been doing or what have you been seeing? So Gulsanna.
So, yeah, you hear me? Okay. The first is, I already mentioned the communication. In our experience, we put a lot into communication and trying to explain how it works and also what are the benefits, and also we're just not like introducing things, when they are done. We started with a consultation. So it's important to give the sense and opportunity to participate in truth. For example, Ukrainians can participate and prioritize what kind of service will be deployed, launched next, or how it should look like, or how, I don't know, even on the city's level, how to rename the main street in the city, and this kind of things are done via digital. And also, in our experience, that support service when something is not working, so it's a really weak place. There should be 24/7 support service working as a really we're competing with business, in this. They're giving us standards, like Booking, Airbnb. So people really used to convenient services and they trust and they feel respected. So this is important for the government to treat your citizens with respect and in all your communication. Regarding the businesses, so there's several parts. I'm speaking from Ukrainian experience. Now we are at the stage where there's very difficult situation, and we have to support. The IT sector is the only one sector that continue. It's unimaginable, but they continue to grow even during the war. So what government should do is really support and create opportunities and cooperate and work with the IT sector, with small and medium enterprises, with tech companies, and bring tech companies to work with Ukraine. So what we did, we opened several initiatives like Digital for Freedom, which just means that everyone can come and test their product with the government in Ukraine. We also created accelerators where but it's mainly focused on military tech because of course it's a priority now for Ukraine. So it's really wide, this kind of vibe of very live cooperation. We do conferences together, we present services together. So this, I think, this is how the trust is built. But of course, one important factor, just like our case, that we see that how the loyalty and trust was increased among the Ukrainian population for fleet when the war started, and then they won't come back. So actually what is mean that they had the opportunity to compare what is brought, what kind of services we build in Ukraine and what they experienced as displaced people in other countries. So yeah, this is our approach.
Francesca?
No, just maybe quickly, because I'm so glad the BBC made the question, no, because I think the role of public broadcasters, it's going to be critical in this open digital public ecosystem. And I think at the level of content, because we're going to see a massive challenge, you know, at the level of the production of content and information. First of all, I think the way to, well, I think actually that the right, I mean, I'm more getting convinced that it's this new type of institutions will be a bit like independent, you know, run public media broadcast. So to guarantee that it's independent actually from the state, but it's publicly funded. So these are the questions when it comes to institutions and the governance of the institutions. I think that it becomes critical that we have long-term public investment and funding, and also that because this guarantees editorial independence and the quality of the content, so we can pay well the journalists and independent journalism, which is the core of democratic, you know, content production. And so the institutions are actually independent, and they run with a board that is independent from the government. I think this is a model that can be applied also to data and to other critical digital infrastructures. I'm getting more and more convinced about that. And when it comes to trust, I think, yeah, the question, for example, that the public media broadcaster should put forward very strongly today is algorithms for the public interest. So how do you make sure that, for example, artificial intelligence and synthetic media, we hold liable, you know, whoever is producing this content, and we make sure that we can audit and inspect the algorithm, and making sure that we have sources that are trustable and trustworthy. And I think this is going to be a fundamental public task. Really a task for digital infrastructures, for the public interest, is this question of how do we trust the news. But at the end, we have to make sure we reward and we invest in good quality journalism and independent content producers, because this is the key for getting the information. So, you know, because in the conversation on technology, we risk to think that we should invest everything into technology, but actually who is producing the good content? Are the journalists, are the creators, are academia, are the researchers, are the people in this room, and not the technology? Yes, so the technology should empower this knowledge creation of good quality to be the one that are accessible by people and by citizens. So, yeah.
No, I think on the content side, clearly you need BBC-like models which have autonomy from the state, have independent funding, at the same time not compromised by any interest. And increasingly that will become important as we have AI-based deepfakes and so on. But the larger issue of trust is if governments enable technology in a way that's beneficial to people and then stick to the promise of making sure they don't tamper with that. I think, you know, today in India, we have 300 million people who use digital payments, not because they were coerced or forced, because they found it very useful. They found it useful to improve their productivity. They found it useful to, you know, increase their safety, because women, vegetable vendors at night did not have to carry cash. It was in their account, so they were less likely to be extorted or robbed. So as you identify these kind of benefits from these things, then people will take to it. In fact, what they have is so difficult that they will adopt anything which makes their life easier.
I just want to say thank you to our panelists. If everybody maybe want to give them a hand of applause for a very stimulating conversation.